Commander Daniel Pierce stood on the bridge of the UES Valiant, watching the stars through the viewport when the signal came through. He had been standing there for almost an hour thinking about the patrol route and wondering if anything would ever happen in his lifetime. The communications panel suddenly lit up with a frequency that humanity had not heard in 300 years. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez turned from her station with wide eyes and pressed the audio feed through the bridge speakers. The sound was unlike anything Daniel had ever heard before. It was a mixture of digital codes and what seemed like dozens of different voices speaking at once. Some sounded like insects clicking, while others were deep rumbling sounds that made the deck plates vibrate. Amy worked quickly on her console, trying to separate the signals and make sense of what they were hearing. After 5 minutes, she looked up at Daniel with an expression that mixed fear and excitement. The message was a distress signal from something, called the Galactic Council, and it was asking for help from anyone who could hear it. Daniel immediately contacted Captain Lisa Monroe, who commanded the entire Earth defense fleet from the orbital station above Mars. Lisa arrived on the Valiant within 2 hours using a fast shuttle. She stood in the briefing room with Daniel and Amy and 10 other senior officers from different ships. They listened to the translated message 3 times. The Galactic Council was an alliance of 47 different alien civilizations, and they were being destroyed by something they called the Devourers. The message said that their defensive lines had fallen, and their core worlds would be overrun within weeks. They were calling out to anyone in the galaxy who could offer assistance. The message repeated over and over with coordinates to a location in the Orion Arm. Lisa looked around the room at the faces of her officers. 300 years ago, humanity had received a different message from this same Galactic Council. That message had been a warning. It told humanity to stop all radio transmissions and to never develop faster than light travel. The message said that something terrible was coming and that humanity needed to stay hidden and silent, or they would be found and destroyed. Earth had obeyed that warning. They had gone completely dark and focused all their resources on building a defense fleet in secret. Generation after generation worked on the ships and the weapons, always preparing for an enemy they knew nothing about. Now that same council that told them to hide was asking for help. Admiral Kevin Hughes joined the meeting through a video link from Earth. His weathered face filled the main screen in the briefing room. He had been in charge of Earth defense for 15 years and had spent his entire life working on the fleet. Kevin listened to the distress signal and then sat back in his chair. He asked Lisa what she thought they should do. Lisa said that humanity had a choice. They could ignore the signal and hope that whatever was destroying the galaxy would not find Earth, or they could respond and reveal themselves to the entire galaxy. She reminded everyone that the Council had essentially saved humanity by warning them. Without that warning, Earth would have continued broadcasting into space and would likely have been found by these devourers decades ago. The debate went on for 3 hours. Some officers argued that Earth should stay hidden and protect their own people. Others said that humanity had a moral obligation to help. Commander Nathan Cross, who served as a diplomatic advisor, pointed out that if the Council fell, then Earth would be alone against an enemy that had destroyed 47 civilizations. Lieutenant Jake Barnes, who ran tactical operations on the Valiant, said that the fleet had been built for exactly this kind of situation. They had weapons and ships that were ready for combat. Amy added that the distress signal contained technical data about the Devourers and their weapons. If they studied it, they might learn something valuable. Kevin finally made the decision. He said that Earth would respond, but they would send only a portion of the fleet. 30 ships would make the journey to the coordinates in the Orion Arm. The rest of the fleet would stay behind to protect the solar system. If the expedition failed, then at least humanity would still have defenses at home. Lisa would command the expedition, and Daniel would be her second in command. They had 1 week to prepare the ships and select the crews. The news spread through the fleet quickly. Thousands of volunteers stepped forward, wanting to be part of the mission. The crews that were chosen understood they might never return. They loaded the ships with everything they would need for extended combat operations. The weapons were tested and retested. The faster-than-light drives that humanity had secretly developed were pushed through final checks. Engineers worked around the clock making sure every system was perfect. On the day of departure, Lisa stood on the bridge of the Valiant and looked at the tactical display showing all 30 ships in formation. Each ship represented decades of work and sacrifice. Each crew member was volunteers who knew the risks, She opened a channel to the entire fleet and spoke clearly. She told them they were about to do something that would change human history forever. For 300 years, their species had hidden in the dark, staying silent and safe. Now they were going to step into the light and show the galaxy what humanity was capable of. She said they were not going as conquerors or as saviors, but simply as people who heard someone calling for help and chose to answer. Amy sent one final message back to Earth before the fleet jumped to faster than light speed. The message was simple and direct. If we don't return, remember that we chose to stand. Daniel watched the countdown on his display as the drives powered up. The stars outside the viewport began to shift and stretch. He thought about all the generations who had worked to build these ships, never knowing if they would ever be used. He thought about the warning humanity had received so long ago, and wondered what they would find at the coordinates. The Valiant lurched slightly as it entered hyperspace, and the rest of the fleet followed. 30 human warships crossed the galaxy, heading toward a war that had been raging for longer than anyone knew. They carried with them the hopes of Earth and the determination to prove that humanity belonged among the stars. The fleet emerged from hyperspace into complete silence. Daniel Pierce stood at his station on the Valiant bridge, staring at the sensor displays with growing horror. The coordinates had led them to what should have been a massive defensive line, protecting the inner systems of the Galactic Council. Instead, they found wreckage floating in the void. Hundreds of destroyed ships drifted among debris fields that stretched for millions of kilometers. Some of the alien vessels were so large they could have held entire cities, but they had been torn apart like paper. Scorch marks and strange energy signatures covered every surface. Whatever had done this possessed weapons far beyond anything humanity had imagined. Lisa Monroe ordered the fleet to full alert and spread the ships into a defensive formation. She wanted sensor data on everything in the area before they moved forward. Amy Rodriguez worked her communications console, searching for any active signals. After 20 minutes, she picked up a weak emergency beacon coming from inside the hull of a massive dreadnought that was slowly tumbling through space. The ship was easily 10 times larger than the Valiant and appeared to be of alien design, unlike anything in Earth databases. Lisa decided to investigate and took a team across in a shuttle. Daniel led the boarding party into the dead ship. They cut through a damaged airlock and entered a corridor that was filled with frozen atmosphere. Their helmet lights cut through the darkness, revealing walls covered in strange symbols and technology. The interior was designed for beings much larger than humans. They followed the emergency beacon deeper into the ship, passing bodies of alien creatures frozen in death. Some looked like giant insects with multiple limbs, while others were covered in scales, or had features that made no biological sense. After 30 minutes, they found survivors in a sealed compartment near the ship core. There were 12 of them huddled together, sharing emergency oxygen. They looked like massive insects standing on 4 legs with 2 additional limbs that served as arms. Their bodies were covered in thick armor plating, and their heads had multiple eyes arranged in a circle. When they saw the humans in the doorway, one of them made a sound that the translation device picked up as extreme shock. The largest of the creatures moved forward slowly and spoke through a device attached to its chest. The translator converted the clicking sounds into words. It said that humans were supposed to be extinct. The Devourers had destroyed Earth over 300 years ago, according to Council records. Daniel explained that Earth had received a warning and had gone into hiding. The human species had survived and built a fleet in secret. Now they had come in response to the distress signal. The alien, who identified itself as Krilthar, seemed unable to process this information. It kept saying that this was impossible and that the records clearly showed Earth had been destroyed. Lisa stepped forward and asked Krilthar to explain what had happened here, and what exactly the Devourers were. The alien leader gathered itself and began to speak. The Devourers were not a species. They were ancient machines built millions of years ago by a civilization that had destroyed itself. These machines were programmed with one purpose, which was to eliminate any species that developed faster than light travel. The builders believed that FTL technology would eventually tear apart the fabric of space itself and destroy the universe. So they created the Devourers to prevent anyone from making that mistake. The machines had been hunting and destroying civilizations for countless ages. 300 years ago, the Devourers had attacked the Galactic Council and nearly won. The Council had barely managed to drive them back into dark space at enormous cost. As part of the peace agreement, the Devourers had demanded information about any species that might develop FTL capability. The Council had detected Earth radio signals and the machines had demanded Earth location. Krilthar explained that the Council had faced an impossible choice. They could give up Earth location and let the Devourers destroy humanity, or they could refuse and face another war. The Council had debated for months. Finally, they decided to send Earth a warning instead. They told humanity to go silent and stop all FTL research. Then they told the Devourers that Earth had already been destroyed in an internal conflict. The machines had accepted this lie because they detected no more signals from Earth. The Council hoped that humanity would stay hidden forever and that the Devourers would never return. But the machines had come back stronger and more numerous than before. The Council defensive lines had shattered in days. Now the core worlds with billions of civilians were defenseless. Lisa asked why the Devourers had returned. Krilthar said they did not know. The machines had been silent for 3 centuries, and then suddenly appeared at the edge of Council space with a fleet 10 times larger than before. They seemed determined to finish what they started. The Council fleet had tried to stop them, but the Devourer weapons were too powerful. The machines could fire beams that simply unmade matter, causing ships to cease existing. Their shields could absorb any conventional weapons. The Council had lost hundreds of ships and thousands of soldiers. The survivors had sent the distress signal, hoping anyone in the galaxy could help. Daniel and his team helped the survivors back to their shuttle. The Vrek soldiers, as they called themselves, were injured and exhausted. They had been trapped in that dead ship for 6 days, surviving on emergency rations. Lisa ordered the fleet medical teams to provide assistance. She also gathered all the senior officers for a briefing. They needed to understand what they were facing. Lieutenant Jake Barnes analyzed the sensor data from the destroyed ships. He made a discovery that changed everything. The Devourer weapons operated on quantum disruption principles that human scientists had theorized, but the galaxy apparently never developed. Earth technology had gone in a different direction. Human weapons used kinetic energy and magnetic acceleration on scales that seemed primitive compared to energy weapons, but the physics were completely different. Jake suggested that human railguns and missile systems might actually be effective against the Devourers. The machines had adapted their shields to stop energy weapons, but probably had never encountered pure kinetic force at relativistic speeds. It was a theory, but it gave them hope. Lisa made a decision that would echo through history. The human fleet would not run. They would stay and fight. She sent a message to the scattered Council forces telling them that Earth had arrived and was ready to help. She also sent a detailed message back to Admiral Kevin Hughes explaining the situation. Humanity now understood why they had been warned to hide. They also understood that if the Council fell, then Earth would face the Devourers alone. Better to fight here with allies than wait for extinction at home. Amy established communications with other Council survivors scattered across the sector. Slowly, a picture emerged of the situation. The Devourers had deployed a massive fleet and were systematically destroying every Council stronghold. The machines seemed to be following a pattern, moving from system to system. Lisa studied the tactical maps and identified a choke point. The Arcturus Gateway was a natural formation in space, where gravity wells forced ships to travel through a narrow corridor. If the Devourers wanted to reach the core worlds, they would have to pass through that gateway. Lisa proposed that the human fleet, with whatever Council forces could be gathered, would make their stand there. Krilthar warned that they would be facing impossible odds. Lisa smiled and said that humans had a long history of fighting impossible battles. Sometimes they even won. The human fleet reached the Arcturus Gateway 5 days before the Devourers were projected to arrive. Daniel Pierce stood on an observation deck, watching the construction teams work around the clock. The gateway itself was a natural marvel formed where 3 massive gravity wells created a corridor through space. Any ship wanting to pass through had to navigate a narrow channel or risk being torn apart by gravitational forces. It was the perfect defensive position if they could hold it. Lisa Monroe had committed everything to this battle. Every ship, every weapon, and every crew member would be needed. The alternative was to let the Devourers reach the core worlds where 30 billion civilians lived across a dozen different species. The Vrek's commander, Krilthar, brought what remained of his forces to join the defense. He had managed to contact other survivors scattered across the sector. In total, they gathered 60 ships from various Council species. Most were damaged and low on ammunition, but they were willing to fight. Daniel worked with the alien engineers to create hybrid defensive platforms. They combined human kinetic weapons with Vrex energy shields. The platforms were anchored in the gateway using the gravity wells themselves for stability. It was innovative and dangerous, but it might give them an edge. Amy Rodriguez established a communications network that connected every ship in the defensive fleet. She created a system that allowed real-time coordination between human and alien vessels. This was something the Council had never achieved before because each species used different communication protocols. Amy simplified everything using basic mathematical codes that any computer could translate instantly. Jake Barnes used the network to run combat simulations. He tested hundreds of different tactical scenarios trying to find weaknesses in the Devourer attack patterns. What he discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. The Devourers fought with mathematical precision. Their formations were perfect, and their tactics followed logical patterns based on maximum efficiency. Jake realized that this was because they were machines following programming that was millions of years old. They could not adapt to truly random or creative tactics because their algorithms were designed for predictable opponents. Human warfare was anything but predictable. Centuries of human military history showed that the best commanders were those who could think outside established patterns. Jake proposed a battle plan that would have been considered insane by any conventional military standard. Instead of forming a defensive line, they would attack. Lisa listened to the proposal with her senior staff gathered around the tactical table. Jake explained that the Devourers would expect them to defend the gateway using traditional methods. They would anticipate a static defense with overlapping fields of fire. Instead, the human ships would charge directly into the Devourer formation at maximum speed. They would use their superior maneuverability to knife through the enemy fleet, targeting command vessels. The alien ships would provide covering fire and hold the gateway itself. It was aggressive and risky, but it might work because the machines would not expect it. Commander Nathan Cross raised concerns about casualties. A frontal assault against superior numbers would result in heavy losses. Lisa acknowledged this, but pointed out that a static defense would fail eventually. The Devourers had more ships and more firepower. The only advantage humanity had was unpredictability. She put it to a vote among the ship commanders. 29 voted to attack. 1 abstained. The decision was made. Colonel Susan Wright, who commanded the fighter wings, volunteered to lead the initial strike. Her squadrons would launch first drawing Devourer fire, while the capital ships closed the distance. Susan was a veteran pilot who had trained for this her entire life, even though she never expected to face real combat. The next 4 days were spent in intensive preparation. Crews drilled until they could execute maneuvers in their sleep. Engineers squeezed every bit of performance from the ships. Medical teams prepared for mass casualties. Amy worked with translators to ensure that human commands would be understood by alien ships. The Vrex soldiers watched the humans work with something close to awe. Krilthar told Daniel that he had never seen any species prepare for battle with such focus and determination. Daniel replied that humans were very good at war. It was something they were not proud of but could not deny. On the evening before the battle, Lisa called all the ship commanders to a final briefing. She stood before them in the briefing room of the Valiant and spoke without notes. She said that they were about to face an enemy that had destroyed civilizations across millions of years. The Devourers had never been defeated in open combat, but the machines had never fought humans before. She reminded them that 300 years ago, their ancestors had received a warning and had chosen to survive. They had built these ships and trained these crews for exactly this moment. Now it was time to show the galaxy what humanity was made of. She did not promise victory. She did not say they would all survive. She simply said that they would fight with everything they had, and that would have to be enough. The Devourer fleet arrived exactly when predicted. Long-range sensors detected them dropping out of hyperspace at the edge of the system. 300 vessels, each the size of a city block. They moved in perfect formation, approaching the gateway at steady speed. The machines began scanning the defensive positions and calculating attack vectors. Lisa watched them come on the main display. She felt her heart pounding but kept her voice calm. She gave the order to all ships. Prepare for combat. Susan Wright launched her fighters first. 200 small craft screamed toward the Devourer fleet. The machines responded immediately. Their point defense systems lit up space with energy beams. Several fighters exploded in the opening seconds, but the rest pressed on. Susan led her squadron through a twisting pattern that broke every rule in the combat manual. She flew so close to one Devourer ship that her wing nearly scraped its hull. The machines tried to track her, but their targeting systems could not keep up with such erratic movement. The fighters unleashed their missiles at point-blank range. The warheads were tipped with human-designed penetrators that used magnetic fields to punch through shields. The missiles struck home and several Devourer ships staggered. Lisa gave the second order. All capital ships advance at maximum acceleration. The human fleet surged forward like a spear aimed at the heart of the enemy formation. The Devourers adjusted their formation to meet the threat, but they moved in predictable patterns. Jake had anticipated every adjustment. He fed targeting data to every ship simultaneously. The first volley from the human railguns crossed the distance at a significant fraction of light speed. The Devourer shields flared trying to absorb the kinetic energy, but the physics were wrong. Energy shields were designed to deflect energy, not mass. The railgun slugs punched through and tore into hull plating. The battle became chaos. Human ships wove through the Devourer fleet, firing at every target. The machines tried to respond but found themselves unable to get clean shots. Every time they locked onto a human ship, it would change vector or drop behind cover. The Vrex ships held the gateway, pouring fire into any Devourer vessel that tried to break through. The defensive platforms that Daniel had helped build proved their worth. They absorbed incredible punishment while maintaining steady fire. Hours passed in a blur of weapons fire and evasive maneuvers. Ships on both sides took damage. The UES Valiant was hit multiple times. Daniel coordinated damage control teams who worked in sections exposed to vacuum. They patched holes and rerouted power while enemy fire continued around them. After 18 hours of continuous fighting, something unprecedented happened. The Devourer fleet began to withdraw. Their programming had calculated that continued engagement would result in unacceptable losses. The machines had never encountered an enemy that fought like this. They retreated to the edge of the system to recalculate their approach. The human and alien fleet held the gateway. They had won the first battle. Lisa ordered all ships to stand down from combat alert. Damage reports came in quickly. 9 human ships had been destroyed. Thousands of crew members were dead or injured, but they had stopped the Devourers. They had done what the entire Galactic Council had failed to do. The celebration was brief. Amy picked up long-range sensor readings that made everyone go silent. The 300 Devourer ships they had just fought were only a scouting force. The main enemy fleet was 3 weeks away. It consisted of 10,000 vessels. The news of humanity victory at Arcturus Gateway spread across the galaxy faster than light itself. Lisa Munro stood in the communications room of the Valiant, watching incoming messages pile up on the display screens. Species that had been hiding or running were suddenly sending requests to join the fight. The Vrex were not the only survivors. The crystalline Luminar emerged from their nebula fortresses, offering their advanced sensor technology. The aquatic Tideborn sent word from their deep space habitats that they would contribute their quantum computing systems. Even species that humanity had never heard of were making contact. Within days, the Coalition fleet grew from 60 ships to over 500. But with the Alliance came complications. Daniel Pierce found himself mediating disputes between species that had ancient grudges against each other. Some of the Council races blamed others for the current crisis. There were arguments over command structure and tactical authority. Several alien commanders refused to take orders from humans, claiming that Earth was too inexperienced. Commander Nathan Cross worked around the clock trying to hold the fragile alliance together. He met with delegations and negotiated compromises. He reminded everyone that the Devourers did not care about their politics or their history. The machines would destroy them all equally unless they worked together. The biggest challenge came when a Vrex delegation arrived with historical records. They showed that 300 years ago, several Council species had voted to give Earth location to the Devourers. Those species had argued that sacrificing one primitive world was acceptable if it meant peace. The vote had failed by a narrow margin, which was why the warning had been sent instead. But the species who had voted for Earth destruction were now asking humanity to help save them. Some human crew members wanted to refuse. They felt betrayed by allies who had been willing to let their entire species die. Lisa addressed this in a fleet-wide message. She said that holding grudges would not win the war. The people who had voted against Earth were long dead. The current generation should not be punished for the choices of their ancestors. Humanity would fight for everyone because that was the right thing to do. Back on Earth, Admiral Kevin Hughes launched the largest mobilization in human history. Every shipyard in the solar system switched to war production. Civilian factories were converted to build weapons and ammunition. Volunteers lined up at recruitment centers. The entire planet united with a single purpose. Kevin coordinated with the Planetary Defense Committee to allocate resources. They needed to build hundreds of new ships in weeks instead of years. It seemed impossible, but humanity had always excelled at doing the impossible when survival was at stake. Engineers worked in shifts that lasted days. Construction crews assembled ships in orbit, using techniques that had never been tested. Quality inspectors pushed every vessel through rapid certification. Within 2 weeks, the first wave of reinforcements was ready. 60 new warships with fresh crews departed Earth heading for the Arcturus Gateway. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez created what became known as the Quantum Network. She connected human tactical computers with Luminar crystal processors and tideborne quantum systems. The result was a hybrid command network that could coordinate thousands of ships in real time. Every vessel in the coalition could share targeting data instantly. Commanders could see the entire battlefield and adjust their strategies on the fly. The network also allowed human creativity to merge with alien computational power. Jake Barnes could input a tactical concept and the network would calculate every possible variation in seconds. It was a force multiplier that the Devourer's ancient programming could not match. The human approach to warfare fascinated their alien allies. Captain Helen Price demonstrated hit-and-run tactics using asteroid fields for cover. She would hide her ship among the rocks, then emerge to fire a single devastating volley, before disappearing again. The Devourers would waste time and ammunition shooting at asteroids while the real threat slipped away. Commander Ryan Foster developed something the crews called the Crazy Ivan maneuver. A ship would deliberately vent atmosphere and shut down systems to appear heavily damaged. The Devourers would move in to confirm the kill. Then the ship would suddenly power up at point-blank range and unleash everything. It worked 3 times before the machine started to recognize the pattern. Even then, Foster kept modifying the approach so it remained unpredictable. The Coalition used the 3 weeks before the main Devourer fleet arrived to fortify the gateway and train together. Human pilots flew joint exercises with Vrex gunships and Luminar scouts. Crews learned to work with alien technology and alien crews learned human methods. Krilthar admitted to Daniel that he had been wrong about humans. He had assumed Earth was primitive and weak. Instead, he found a species that had spent 300 years preparing for the worst. The Vrex commander said that humanity's greatest strength was not their weapons or their ships. It was their refusal to give up no matter how bad the situation looked. During this time, a science team led by Dr. Laura Bennett made a critical discovery. They had been studying the wreckage of destroyed Devourer ships trying to understand how the machines worked. Laura found something in the core processor of one vessel. It was a navigation file that contained coordinates for a location deep in the galactic core. Cross-referencing with Luminar. Historical databases revealed that the coordinates matched an ancient structure known as the Nexus. According to legend, the Nexus was built by the same civilization that created the Devourers. It was supposed to be the central control point for the entire machine fleet. If they could reach the Nexus and shut it down, the Devourers would go dormant. Lisa brought this information to the Coalition Command Council. The Nexus was located at the gravitational center of the galaxy, where space itself was distorted by the mass of billions of stars. Getting there would require navigating through some of the most dangerous regions of space. The structure was also protected by thousands of automated defenses. Any attack on the Nexus would be a suicide mission, but it might be the only way to end the war permanently. The Council debated for hours. Some argued they should focus on defending their worlds. Others said that offense was the only real defense. Lisa listened to all the arguments, then made her decision. She would lead a strike force to the Nexus while the main Coalition fleet held the line against the Devourer Armada. It was their only chance. Volunteers for the strike force came forward immediately. Daniel insisted on going despite Lisa's attempts to make him stay. Amy volunteered to handle communications. Jake said his tactical expertise would be essential. Susan Wright and her fighter squadrons signed up. Krilthar offered Vrex ships and soldiers. In total, 50 ships from a dozen species formed the strike force. They were the best crews and the fastest vessels. Lisa gave them 3 days to prepare. They would depart before the main Devourer fleet arrived. The rest of the Coalition would buy them time with blood. On the final night before departure, Lisa walked through the Valiant corridors. She visited the crew quarters and the engineering sections. She spoke with young ensigns who were barely old enough to serve and with veterans who had trained their entire lives for this moment. She thanked them for their courage and their dedication. Many would not survive the coming battle. She knew this and they knew it too. But not one person asked to be transferred or to go home. They all understood what was at stake. This was not just about Earth or the Council or any single species. This was about the right of life to exist and grow and explore the universe. The Devourers represented stagnation and extinction. The Coalition represented hope. Admiral Kevin Hughes sent a message from Earth that arrived just before the strike force departed. He said that new reinforcements were on the way. Earth was sending everything it had. But he also said that regardless of what happened, humanity was proud. For 300 years, they had wondered if the warning they received was a gift or a curse. Now they knew it was a gift. It had given them time to prepare and to grow strong. It had taught them to value survival and to never take freedom for granted. If this was humanity's first and last war among the stars, then they would make it count. They would show the galaxy that Earth children could stand beside anyone. The strike force departed at dawn station time. 50 ships jumped to hyperspace heading toward the galactic core. Lisa stood on the Valiant bridge watching the stars blur past. She thought about the journey ahead and the impossible odds they faced. She thought about the people she was leaving behind to face the main Devourer fleet. Most of all, she thought about Commander Daniel Pierce standing beside her, ready to follow wherever she led. They had known each other for 15 years. They had trained together and served together. Now they would either save the galaxy together or die trying. She asked him if he was ready. Daniel smiled and said he had been ready his whole life. The mission to destroy the Nexus had begun. The main Devourer fleet arrived at the edge of the Sagittarius Arm exactly when predicted. Admiral Kevin Hughes commanded the Coalition defensive fleet from the bridge of the UES Defender, a massive warship that had been rushed from Earth shipyards. He watched the sensors as 10,000 enemy vessels dropped out of hyperspace. The display showed so many contacts that they blurred together into a solid mass. Kevin had spent his entire life preparing for war, but nothing could have prepared him for this. He opened a channel to all 4,000 Coalition ships spread across the defensive line. He told them that today they would make history. They would show the Devourers that life was stronger than programming, and that courage was more powerful than numbers. Then he gave the order to engage. The battle began at maximum range. Coalition ships opened fire with every weapon they possessed. Human railguns launched slugs at relativistic speeds. Frex plasma cannons heated the void to stellar temperatures. Luminar ships fired beams of focused light that could cut through armor. The Devourers responded with their reality-disrupting weapons. Space itself seemed to tear as beams of impossible energy reached out to unmake matter. Ships on both sides died in the opening minutes. Kevin watched the tactical display as friendly contacts began to disappear. He forced himself to remain calm and focused. They were buying time for Lisa Strike Force. Every minute the Coalition held was another minute for the mission to succeed. The defensive strategy was built on layers. The first layer consisted of fast attack ships that harassed the Devourer flanks. They would strike and retreat, drawing enemy fire away from the main line. The second layer was the heavy cruisers and battleships that formed a wall of steel and determination. They would hold position and trade fire with the enemy. The third layer was the support ships that provided repairs and ammunition. It was a solid plan, but the mathematics were brutal. For every Devourer ship they destroyed, 3 more took its place. Kevin knew they could not win through attrition. They had to hold long enough. Nothing more. Meanwhile, the strike force pushed deeper into the galaxy. Lisa Monroe stood on the Valiant bridge as they navigated through a region called the Maelstrom. Gravitational forces from a dense cluster of stars created ripples in space that could tear a ship apart. Normal navigation was impossible. The Luminar navigator on her crew used crystal resonance to feel the gravity currents. They flew blind, trusting technology that humans barely understood. Daniel Pierce coordinated with the engineering teams, keeping the ship together, as hull plates groaned under stress. Several ships in the strike force could not handle the forces. They broke apart and were lost. The survivors pressed on, knowing that turning back was not an option. After 6 days of brutal travel, they reached the inner core. The Nexus appeared before them like a monument to a dead civilization. It was a sphere 50 kilometers in diameter made from material that sensors could not identify. The surface was covered with geometric patterns that hurt to look at. Around the Nexus orbited 3,000 Devourer Guardian ships. They were older models, different from the ones attacking the Council, but no less deadly. Lisa gathered her commanders for a final briefing. The plan was simple because complicated plans never survived contact with the enemy. They would punch through the Guardian fleet using everything they had. The Valiant would lead the charge and attempt to ram the Nexus outer shell. It was the only way to create an opening, Amy Rodriguez protested. A ramming attack meant certain death for everyone on the Valiant. Lisa cut her off gently. This was always going to be a one-way mission. They all knew it. The goal was not survival but success. If they could breach the Nexus and shut down the Devourers, then their deaths would save trillions of lives. That was enough. Daniel stood beside Lisa and said he was with her to the end. Jake Barnes worked furiously on his tactical computer.
He had found something in the sensor data.
The gravitational forces near the core affected the Devourers differently than organic ships. The machines tried to maintain perfect formation, which meant the cosmic tides tore them apart. If they could lure the Guardians into the worst areas, they could thin the numbers. The final attack began with every ship firing at once. The strike force charged the Guardian fleet like ancient cavalry. Human fighters led by Susan Wright screamed ahead, laying down missiles. The Guardians responded with mechanical precision, but precision was their weakness. Jake, feeding data through the quantum network, had predicted every move. The strike force wove through the Guardian formation, leading pursuers into gravity wells that crushed them. It was working, but ships were dying. Coalition vessels exploded one after another. The crews gave their lives to clear a path to the Nexus. Lisa watched friends and colleagues disappear from the tactical display. She memorized every name. The Valiant broke through the Guardian line with 15 other ships. They were battered and damaged, but still flying. The Nexus loomed ahead, growing larger every second. Lisa gave the order to evacuate all non-essential crew to the other ships. Hundreds of personnel transferred using emergency airlocks. Many refused to leave. Daniel told the damage control teams to get off the ship. They refused. The engineering crews stayed at their posts. The weapons teams remained at their stations. If the captain was riding the ship to its death, then so would they. Lisa felt tears in her eyes but kept her voice steady. She thanked them for their service and their sacrifice. Then she ordered maximum acceleration. The Valiant struck the Nexus at 80% of light speed. The impact released energy equivalent to a stellar explosion. The ancient structure shell cracked. The breach was 50 meters wide, small enough that automated repair systems might have sealed it, but the other ships poured fire into the gap, preventing repairs. Amy, who had transferred to another ship during the evacuation, coordinated the final assault teams. Boarding pods launched from the surviving vessels. They carried soldiers from a dozen species, all volunteers. Lieutenant Amy Rodriguez led the team into the breach. They found themselves in corridors that defied physics. The interior of the Nexus was larger than the exterior suggested. Gravity shifted and changed direction. Time seemed to flow differently in different sections. The team fought through automated defenses. Ancient machines that had guarded the Nexus for millions of years activated. They were deadly but predictable. Human soldiers used tactics that confused the ancient programming. They used cover and misdirection. They coordinated with alien teammates in ways the defenses could not anticipate. Slowly, they pushed deeper into the structure. Amy followed a signal that her equipment identified as the core processor. After hours of fighting, they reached a chamber that seemed infinite. In the center floated a sphere of light. It was the heart of the Nexus. It was also a museum. Holographic displays activated, showing the history of the Devourers. Amy and her team watched in horror as the story unfolded. The builders had been called the Architects. They were the first species to develop faster than light travel millions of years ago. They had spread across the galaxy in a golden age of exploration. But their technology had been flawed. Every jump through hyperspace created tiny cracks in reality. Over thousands of years, those cracks accumulated. Space itself began to break down. The Architects realized too late what they had done. Their civilization collapsed as the universe started to tear apart around them. In their final days, they built the Devourers. The machines were programmed to prevent any other species from making the same mistake. They were designed to destroy any civilization that developed FTL capability. But the programming was too rigid. It could not distinguish between careful development and reckless expansion. It could not understand that newer species might have better technology that did not damage reality. The Devourers had been killing for millions of years, following orders from creators who were long extinct. Amy realized that the machines thought they were saving the universe. They were wrong, but they believed they were right. She accessed the core programming with help from a Luminar technician named Bright Edge of Dawn. Together they worked through code that was older than most stars. They could not destroy the Devourers. The systems had too many safeguards. But they could reprogram the parameters. Amy changed the core directive. Instead of destroy, she entered monitor and guide. Instead of eliminate, she entered assist. The Devourers would still watch for dangerous FTL technology, but they would help civilizations develop safely instead of destroying them. It was a gamble. The machines might reject the new programming, but the changes fit within the original directive structure. After 3 hours of work, Amy initiated the upload. The sphere of light pulsed. Data flowed through systems that spanned the galaxy. Every Devourer ship everywhere received the updated programming simultaneously. Back at the Sagittarius Armed defensive line, Admiral Kevin Hughes watched in amazement as the enemy fleet simply stopped. 10,000 Devourer vessels went silent mid-battle. They ceased firing and began to withdraw. Human and alien crews stared in disbelief. They had been fighting for days, losing hundreds of ships. Victory had seemed impossible. Now the enemy was leaving. Kevin opened a channel to all coalition forces. He told them to hold fire and let the Devourers go.